Men talk about fortune as if it were something you could find at the bottom of a river, but out here, fortune's whatever keeps you alive till the thaw. From the Journal of Thomas Red Hanlon, 1833. The Green River Valley was thick with smoke that summer, the kind that clings to your clothes and stays in your hair for weeks after the fires are out. The last beaver pelts of the season hung from poles like ragged flags, and men bartered them for whiskey, powder, or a tin of coffee. There was talk that the trade was dying. London fashion had turned against felt hats, and the big companies were bleeding silver, but that didn't stop the trappers from celebrating as if the mountains were still theirs. The rendezvous of 33 was one for the books. You could hear the laughter a mile off, echoing between the cottonwoods. Half the camp was drunk by sundown, the other half by moonrise. Men gambled away horses, rifles, even the shirts off their backs, and through it all moved Red Hanlon, tall, wiry, hair the color of iron rust, eyes that had stared too long into the glare of snowfields. He carried a pack that was too heavy for a man with nothing to sell, and a look in his eye that made even old hands step aside. Hanlon wasn't the kind to talk more than he needed to. He'd spent too many winters alone up past the Gros Ventres or down along the Yampa, living on whatever the traps gave him. But that night, he had something to show. Something he said would change everything. It began around the trader's fire, when the whiskey had loosened tongues. Kit Carson himself was said to be in camp that year, though whether he ever sat near Red is a story that shifts with the telling. What's certain is that a crowd gathered when Hanlon unrolled a piece of buckskin on the ground, the edges burned and curling like autumn leaves. "This here," he said, his voice low and measured, "was found west of the Wind River Range, a canyon you won't see on any company map. I call it the River of Fire." The men leaned closer. The buckskin showed a crude sketch, mountains drawn as sharp peaks, a winding river, and strange marks that looked like suns scratched into the hide. A line of ink led to a circle scrawled in ochre. "That's where I found it," Hanlon said. "Gold, not flakes, not dust, chunks. The kind you could pick out of the gravel with your hands." Laughter broke first from a grizzled Frenchman named Baptiste. "Gold? Bah, Spaniards been chasin' that ghost 100 years. Ain't no gold in these mountains, just frostbite and fever." Another trapper spat into the fire. "You got more chance findin' a mermaid in the green than gold west o' Wind River." Hanlon didn't rise to it. He just kept staring at the map, one hand resting on his knee. "Believe what you like," he said, "but I saw it. The rocks were streaked with it." Sunlight caught in the stone. Someone called out from the shadows, "You been drinkin' your pay early, Red?" And the laughter rolled again, louder this time. He tried to explain the canyon walls higher than any he'd seen, the color of the river, the old Spanish symbols carved into stone, but they'd already turned away. To the men of the mountains, gold was an Eastern man's sickness. Beaver was the only coin worth trapping, and even that coin was losing its shine. Still, a few lingered young ones, mostly drawn by the strange look in Red's eyes. There was something feverish there, a light that didn't come from whiskey. One of them, a boy no older than 20, asked, "You say you marked the place?" Red nodded. "Made note of it on this here hide. Every ridge, every river bend. Then let's see it proper." He knelt and spread the map flat, using stones to hold the corners. The firelight danced across the hide, making the ink glimmer like wet blood. But before he could trace the route with his finger, a boot came down hard in the middle of the map. It was Baptiste again, drunk and grinning. "Ain't no map gonna make you rich, Hanlon. You got fever. I seen it before." Red lunged up, shoving the Frenchman back. The two men grappled, knocking over the fire pit. Sparks flew into the night like fireflies gone mad. Someone kicked a burning log, and the flames jumped across the buckskin. "Get it off! Goddammit, get it off!" Red shouted. He beat at the hide with his hands, smothering the fire with his coat. The air filled with the stench of singed leather and smoke. By the time they pulled him off, the damage was done, half the map was gone, the rest blackened and curling in his grip. Baptiste staggered back, face split with a drunken grin. "Now there's your gold," Red melted to ashes. Red said nothing. His knuckles were bleeding, his coat smoldering. He gathered what was left of the hide and walked away into the darkness. No one stopped him. He went down to the river, where the moonlight silvered the ripples, and sat on a fallen log. The night sounds rose around him, the distant bawl of mules, the cry of a night hawk, the soft breathing of the land itself. He spread the charred hide across his knees. Half the markings were gone, but enough remained, a line here, a mark there, to keep the image alive in his mind. He remembered the place he'd seen months before. A narrow gorge cut deep into the earth, the rocks shimmering under the sun as if painted with fire. He hadn't had time to dig, not with winter closing in. But he'd taken that piece of ore, heavy as sin, and swore he'd return. Behind him, the sounds of revelry still echoed faintly across the valley. The trappers would drink till dawn, trade till their purses were empty, then vanish back into the hills. By next year, half of them would be gone, killed by Blackfeet, fever, or their own foolishness. But Red Hanlon would not be among them. He had seen something no one else had, and it burned in him brighter than the fire that ruined his map. He took a knife and trimmed away the blackened edges, folding what was left into his coat. "Ain't over yet," he muttered. "Not while I can still see it in my head." When he rose, the moon was high, painting the peaks of the Wind River Range in pale light. Somewhere out there, hidden beyond those cold ridges, lay the canyon he'd found and lost. He turned once toward the camp, the laughter, the sparks rising from 100 fires, and then away. The sound faded behind him as he walked into the dark, boots crunching in the frost. By morning, no one could say where Red Hanlon had gone. Some thought he'd headed west toward the Snake. Others claimed he'd frozen before winter's end. But those who saw him last remembered one thing clearly. He was still clutching that piece of charred buckskin like a promise he meant to keep. In years to come, men would speak of Red Hanlon's River of Fire the way they spoke of El Dorado or the Lost Adams. Digging's half truth, half ghost story. But in the summer of 1833, it was just a map in the ashes and a man who refused to let it die. A map ain't worth the hide it's drawn on unless you got the grit to follow it. The mountains keep their secrets until a man's near starved enough to deserve 'em. From the Journal of Thomas Red Hanlon, 1834. A year passed before Red Hanlon spoke of the burned map again. By then, most men from the rendezvous of 33 were scattered, some dead, some gone east with their pay. The beaver trade was drying up like the rivers themselves, and the old trails were turning quiet. Red had drifted north along the Snake, trapping what little fur the mountains still offered, his mind fixed on that hidden canyon west of the Wind River Range, the one the others had called a fever dream. When the last of the traps came up empty, he knew it was time. He sold his pelts at Fort Hall for a pittance, 8 plues to the pound of powder, and began to gather what he needed for the long road west. A mule, a rifle, a sack of cornmeal, and the scorched remnant of the map folded so many times the hide was thin as paper. He wasn't going alone. Pierre Long-Knife Ducharme was a French-Canadian interpreter with a face weathered like old bark and a laugh that could thaw ice. He'd spent years trading among the Shoshone and spoke their tongue better than English. It was he who brought along Nakoa, a quiet Shoshone hunter with the steady patience of a man raised on mountains. The three made a small company, but enough to pass through the wild without drawing too much notice. They set out in late September, when the nights were sharp and the aspens gold. The Snake River shimmered to their right, a long vein of silver cutting through the basalt plains. Red kept to the trail as best he could, following the memory of his burned map. He believed the River of Fire lay somewhere beyond the western slope of the Wind River Range, near a country few white men had entered. Ducharme called it La Terre du Silence, the land of silence. Nakoa said it had another name among his people, Cuchillo del Oro, the knife of gold. When Red heard that, his pulse quickened. "You've heard of it, then?" Nakoa nodded slowly. "My grandfather told of white men, Spaniards who came with slaves and mules, many winters ago. They cut into the mountain for yellow stone. The spirits took them. None returned." Red stared into the fire that night, thinking of the burned map and the symbols that might have been Spanish. He remembered the markings on the canyon walls, the same curling suns carved into stone. The trail west grew cruel. The rivers shrank into dust, and the wind carried sand sharp enough to peel skin. Food ran low. One by one, the mules gave out, their ribs showing through their hides. They followed dry washes and gullies where the wind had piled bones of bison long dead. Twice they were driven off by Ute scouts, unseen but close enough that the whistle of arrows cut the air. By November, the land had turned barren, a stretch of sage and broken rock. Red's beard had gone gray at the chin, and his eyes had sunk deep into his face, but he refused to turn back. One night they camped beneath a cliff marked with strange symbols, crosses, and spirals cut into the sandstone, blackened by age. Ducharme traced the carvings with a trembling finger. "Spaniards," he whispered. "I seen marks like this south, near Santa Fe." Nakoa knelt beside him, touching one of the spirals. "My people say those men tried to take what the mountain would not give. The ground swallowed them, or hid their gold," Red murmured. The next morning, a sandstorm rolled down from the north. It came sudden and hard, a wall of dust that swallowed the world. They covered their faces and huddled behind the mules, but the storm tore through everything: packs, food, even the burned scrap of hide Red carried in his coat. When it cleared, the sun was gone, and the world looked new again, the old trail erased. "We've lost the way," Ducharme said, coughing dust. Red lifted his eyes to the west. The mountains there glowed faintly red under the sinking sun. "No," he said, "it's showing us where to go." They pushed on, half blind, guided by instinct and stubborn faith. 3 days later, Nakoa stopped suddenly on a ridge. Below them lay a valley split by a narrow gorge, and at its base, just visible through the haze, a flash of color like sunlight caught in stone. Red's breath hitched. He pulled the broken hide from his coat, holding it against the horizon. The curve of the ridge, the shape of the river bend it all, matched what little remained of his map. Ducharme crossed himself. "By God, maybe you weren't crazy after all." They descended slowly, camped near the mouth of the gorge, and listened to the wind moan through the rock. Red felt the old fire rising in him, again the same that burned when he first saw that canyon 2 winters before. That night he wrote by firelight, "The Spaniard's ghost is real. The mountains guard his secret still. But I swear by every mile I've walked I will find his gold and prove them all wrong." As he laid down his pen, Nakoa pointed to the stars. "Storms come again tomorrow," he said softly. "We should move before the mountain changes her face." Red only nodded, too fixed on the thought of gold to hear the warning. By dawn, the storm clouds were already building on the horizon. He folded the map once more, tucking it close to his heart, unaware that the mountain was listening and that it remembered the last men who had come searching for its fire. In the years that followed, the Shoshone would still speak of that winter storm, the one that buried a canyon and hid it from men's eyes for nearly a decade. And somewhere beneath that silence, a prospector's dream slept, waiting for Red Hanlon to return. The mountains don't kill a man outright. They starve him, freeze him, test what's left till he either quits or belongs to them. From the Journal of Thomas Red Hanlon, Winter of 1835. By the time the snows came, Red Hanlon's party was down to 2. Ducharme had taken fever in November and never rose again. They buried him in a shallow grave on the edge of the desert, his cross carved from willow. Nakoa marked the site with a stone cairn and said a prayer in his tongue. After that, it was only Red and the Shoshone, following the Snake north toward the timbered valleys near Henry's Fork. There they found shelter in a hollow known among the trappers as Pierre's Hole, a long meadow hemmed by dark spruce and shadowed by the Tetons. Winter closed in early that year. The snow came hard, heavy as sand poured from the sky. Game vanished into the timber. Rivers froze clean through, trapping fish beneath glass. The world turned white and still. Red and Nakoa built a cabin of pine logs no larger than a stall, roofed with bark and snow. The smoke hole in the center let out more heat than it kept in, but it was home enough. They stacked what meat they could, mostly elk jerky, dried, bitter, and thin, and settled in for the long wait. It was a silence only the mountains know. No voices, no horses, just the wind keening through the trees. For days they hardly spoke. Nakoa carved bone needles and mended snowshoes. Red worked by firelight, sketching from memory the map he'd lost. His fingers, stiff from cold, traced lines he could almost see behind his eyes, the sweep of the canyon, the curve of the river, the cross of peaks to the west. He spoke to himself as he drew. There was a ridge there, yes, and a spur that caught the light. The quartz ran through the face like lightning. Nakoa would glance up now and then, but said nothing. To him, the map was a ghost, something that had already cost too many lives. Weeks passed, food dwindled, the elk vanished deeper into the timber, and what traps they'd set froze solid in the creeks. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of snow. On the coldest nights, Red dreamed of fire gold glinting in the rocks, a river that shimmered like molten sun. He'd wake with frost on his beard and his hands clenched tight around the rolled hide beside his bed. One night, Nakoa broke the silence. "Why do you chase it?" he asked. "The yellow stone. What does it bring a man?" Red sat up slowly, feeding a stick into the fire. "You've never been east, have you?" "No. Back there, a man's worth is measured in what he can carry in his purse. You can trap all your life, break your back in the mountains, and still die owing the company more than you earned. But gold makes a man free. I'd like to know that feeling before I die." Nakoa studied him through the smoke. "And if the mountain does not wish to be found," Red gave a short laugh, "then she'll have to kill me outright." Outside, the wind rose, the door shuddered against its hinges, and the fire guttered low. Red stood and braced it shut, listening to the storm howl like a living thing. That night the snow came so heavy it buried the cabin halfway to the roof. For 3 days they stayed inside, burning the last of their pine logs, living on melted snow and the scraps of dried meat left in a sack. When the storm finally broke, the world had changed. The trees bent under ice, the mountains hidden behind a veil of white. They dug themselves out slowly. Red's hands were cracked and raw, his beard rimed with frost. But his eyes burned with the same light that had carried him this far. By late February, the snow began to crust. Nakoa went out each day on snowshoes, tracking elk along the ridges. Red stayed behind, working on his map. He'd spread the parchment across the table, adding new markings with charcoal and grease. Sometimes he'd talk aloud to the ghost of Ducharme or to the memory of the Spaniard, whose trail he believed he followed. "See here," he'd mutter, tapping the page. "This ridge she runs straight toward the Wind River. The gold lies beyond it, just where the light breaks at dawn. I know it." One evening Nakoa returned early, carrying a frozen ptarmigan. He set it by the fire, but his face was troubled. "Tracks in the timber," he said. "Not elk, men. Trappers? Maybe crow, maybe worse." They posted watch that night, rifles across their knees. Nothing came. But the fear stayed. In the mountains, men were as dangerous as wolves, especially hungry ones. By March, the food was gone. They boiled hide, chewed leather, burned furniture for heat. Nakoa's cheeks grew hollow. Red's fingers trembled when he tried to write. On the 15th day of hunger, Nakoa slipped away at dawn, rifle on his back. He said nothing, only nodded once. Red waited 3 days. When he finally went looking, he found tracks leading toward the ridge, then nothing. The snow had swallowed him whole. He came back to the cabin alone, sat by the cold ashes, and opened his journal. "The mountain's taken him," he wrote. "Same as Ducharme, same as it'll take me if I stay, but I can feel the gold close, too close to quit." He packed what little he had left a flint, a strip of dried meat, his map, and left Pierre's hole behind, heading toward the faint blue peaks that marked the Wind River country. Behind him, the cabin sagged under snow, its roof caving in with a muffled sigh. The mountain had tested him and found him wanting, but it had not yet broken him. As he disappeared into the white silence, his footprints filled with drifting powder, vanishing almost as soon as they were made. Years later, trappers passing through Pierre's hole found the cabin still standing. Inside, on a table blackened with smoke, lay a charcoal sketch of a canyon, and a single line scrawled beneath it. "The mountain keeps what it gives." Sometimes the earth opens not to show you her riches, but to see if you're fool enough to reach for them. From the Journal of Thomas Red Hanlon, 1837. Red Hanlon came out of that winter looking like a man carved from the mountain itself, gaunt, cracked, and hollow-eyed. Yet he walked. He had buried too many friends and too many dreams to quit now. The burned map was gone to ash long ago, but the image of it lived clear as daylight in his head. He followed the Wind River south through April thaw, when the ice broke in slabs and the valleys filled with fog. Game was coming back, the elk thin but alive, the air full of the smell of pine. Red moved like a ghost through it, trapping only enough to eat. His true hunt lay ahead. By the time he crossed the Continental Divide, he'd been alone for near 2 years. Every bend of the range whispered against his memory. He knew he was close. Then, one evening, he found it. It happened sudden, as most miracles do. Red was climbing a ridge above a creek, swollen with meltwater. When the ground fell away beneath him, a sheer drop into a gorge that had no right to be there. The canyon yawned, deep and narrow, hidden by ridges from every side. The rock burned red in the dying sun, striped with white quartz veins that caught the light like frozen lightning. He sank to his knees. "By God," he whispered, "you're real." For hours he stood on that rim, staring. Below, the river twisted through the stone like molten metal. It wasn't wide, but it glowed the whole canyon alive with the shimmer of mica and quartz. And through the quartz, he saw it. Dull yellow streaks, thin but pure. Gold, running through the rock like fire. He laughed, then a wild, broken laugh that echoed off the cliffs until even the birds went silent. All that night he worked his way down, using elk-hide rope and the roots of twisted pines. The descent tore his hands and nearly cost him his life when a foothold gave way. But by dawn, he stood at the bottom. The canyon walls rose straight as fort walls around him, the river cutting narrow and swift. He found the same symbols he'd seen years ago, crosses, suns, spirals, all Spanish marks, blackened by age. A rusted chisel lay half buried in silt, its handle long gone. "They were here," he murmured. "By thunder, they were here." He broke open a piece of the vein with the butt of his rifle. The stone split clean, and inside was gold raw and coarse, glittering in the morning light. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it. All the ridicule, the laughter at Green River, the long winters, every ounce of mockery melted in that moment. He stayed 3 days in the canyon, mapping what he could on the back of an old journal page. The river twisted like a serpent through stone, and on the north wall a ledge rose toward daylight. He marked it carefully. Providence Gulch. On the 3rd day clouds rolled in fast and dark. The air went, strange, heavy as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Red gathered what he could ore, samples, sketches, and started for the rim. Halfway up, the storm broke. Rain lashed the rock, thunder booming through the gorge. He climbed blindly, mud turning to slick clay beneath his boots. A crack split the air, then the mountains answered. A rock slide thundered down from above, smashing into the riverbed below. Red clung to the wall, choking on dust. When it cleared, the canyon floor was gone, buried beneath tons of stone. The river had vanished under the debris. He shouted Nakoa's name before he remembered there was no one left to hear it. Hours later, bruised and shaking, he crawled over the rim and lay face down in the mud. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. When he finally looked back, the gorge was shrouded in mist, silent and unreal. He wrote that night by the dim glow of his fire. "I found the canyon again, and she near killed me for it. The gold is there more than I ever dreamed, but the mountain guards it like a mother, her child. Maybe the others were right. Maybe it was meant to stay buried." He stared at the fire until his vision blurred, then folded the sketches into oilskin and sealed them tight. When dawn came, the canyon was gone from sight, fog thick as milk, not a trace of the gleaming walls below. Only the echo of the river remained, whispering faint through the mist. Red turned away at last, limping toward the lowlands. He had proof enough now to show the world. But as he walked, the wind rose behind him, curling through the peaks. It sounded almost like laughter, low, distant, and cruel. Later surveyors would argue whether the canyon he described ever existed at all. But those who searched long enough in the shadow of the Wind River Range sometimes spoke of a place where the stone shone like fire when the sun went down, a place the maps refused to keep. By the time Red Hanlon came down out of the mountains, the fur trade was gasping its last breath. The great rendezvous were ending skins, no longer fetched a living, and steamboats now carried cheap beaver felt from Canada and Europe. The trappers who once ruled the Rockies were drifting eastward, selling their rifles, their horses, and what remained of their pride. Red came into street, Louis half-starved, his beard gone gray, his buckskin stiff with travel. He led a pack mule that carried more stone than fur raw ore wrapped in elk hide, heavy enough to bow the beast's back. To most men it was worthless weight. To Red Hanlon it was proof. He stabled the mule, washed the mountain dust from his face, and went straight to the office of Thomas Pritchard, the government's fur trade clerk and part-time investor in Frontier Ventures. Pritchard looked up from his ledger as Red entered. The man was sharp-faced, precise, and already weary of wild-eyed trappers with discoveries. "Well," he said, not even rising, "if it isn't another prophet of the Golden West." "What's your miracle worth today, Mr. Hanlon?" Red dropped a fist-sized rock on the desk. It split clean, spilling a shimmer of yellow dust across the clerk's papers. Pritchard blinked, then leaned forward. "Where in God's name did you find this?" "In the Wind River country," Red said. "A canyon that don't appear on any map. The river runs through stone like fire, veins thick as a man's finger. I marked it. I can take you there." The clerk turned the specimen in his hand. It was heavy. Real. But his face didn't change. "You expect me to believe you stumbled upon a gold river where 100 Spaniards and half the Crow Nation never found so much as a nugget?" Red's jaw tightened. "I don't expect you to believe anything, sir. I expect you to see what's in front of you." Pritchard smiled thinly. "I see a man desperate to be remembered." He pushed the gold aside and opened his ledger, dipping his quill. "You. Trappers all come down the same, one winter away from starvation, another from madness. Beaver's done, and now you want to strike it rich. There's always a secret canyon, always a hidden vein. But when I send men after it, nothing but shale and fool's gold." "I ain't askin' you to send men," Red said quietly. "Just one. To witness." The clerk shook his head. "No investment without verification, and no verification without safety. You've got no maps, no coordinates, just a story and some glittering stones. If you were wise, you'd sell the ore to a jeweler and keep your peace." Red's voice broke then, rough as unsharpened steel. "That gold's enough to change this country. Enough to make towns rise where the buffalo still run. I seen it." Pritchard dipped the quill again. "Then you'll forgive me for needing more than a trapper's word. Write it down, mister. Hanlon, where, when, what you found. If it's worth the ink, perhaps someone with means will buy your dream." For a long moment Red didn't move. Then he sat, his hands shaking as he sketched the canyon's outline from memory, the twisted river, the quartz ridges, the marks carved by Spanish hands centuries before. He signed it Thomas Hanlon, April 1837. Pritchard glanced at the map, then at the man. "I'll keep this," he said. "For the record." When Red left the office, dusk had fallen. Steamboats glowed like floating lanterns along the riverfront, and the smell of smoke and whiskey hung in the air. He stood watching the lights a long while, listening to the city hum like a hive. Behind him, in Pritchard's office, the clerk weighed the ore again under lamplight. It gleamed true to true. He hesitated, then locked it in a drawer, tucking the map beneath it. He would later tell his partners it was a trapper's hoax, a delusion born of hunger and mountain air. Yet in the months that followed, More than one prospector came through his door, asking after a red Hanlon and his river of gold. And though Pritchard denied it, rumors began to spread along the Missouri docks that somewhere west of the Wind River Range, a canyon full of buried sunlight waited for the man bold or mad enough to find it. As for Hanlon, he vanished again into the high country the next spring, chasing the only thing that had ever believed in him, the map burned into his mind. The skeptics would record him as a liar. The mountains as something else entirely. The mountains remembered him. When Red Hanlon returned 2 years later, the land seemed to breathe him in like old smoke, recognizing the scent of a man who'd once bled on its stones. He came with no company this time, no witnesses, no mules heavy with trade goods, only a rifle, a pickaxe, and the memory of a canyon that shouldn't exist. The traders in Laramie had called him mad. "You'll die up there, Hanlon," one said as Red loaded his horse. "The gold fever's taken, you same as it did the Spaniards." Red only smiled a cracked smile. "Then I reckon I'll die rich." He followed the same trail he had carved years before, through snowmelt rivers and elk-thick valleys, past the bones of old rendezvous camps now overgrown with grass. Beaver pelts no longer brought a dime in Street Louis, what the mountains had once given freely, the markets no longer cared to buy. But gold, that was the new frontier. Red carried no map, only his memory. The burned hide had long been ash, but he could still see it as clear as day, the curling lines, the river twisting like a serpent through the stone. He slept little, eating jerky by cold fires, climbing from dawn to dusk until the peaks turned blue and silent around him. On the 8th day, he found the sign he'd prayed for, a crooked pine, lightning struck, the bark burned black where he'd once tied Nakoa's rope. His heart thudded hard enough to hurt. By noon he reached the ridge and stopped dead. The canyon had changed. Where the rock slide had sealed it years before, the river had forced itself anew, carving a jagged channel through rubble. The sun was high, and the whole gorge burned in gold light. Quartz shimmered in the walls like frost. Dust hung over everything, a haze that glowed in the heat. Red dropped to his knees. The sight made him dizzy. "By thunder," he whispered. "You waited for me." He descended slow, the air growing hotter with every step. At the bottom, the river ran shallow but swift, its bed glittering with flecks that caught the sun. He knelt, scooped a handful, and stared gold, pure and fine as sugar. The water itself seemed alive with it, swirling liquid fire. It was real. It had always been real. He laughed then, full-throated and wild, echoing off the cliffs. For hours he worked the shallows with a pan hammered from tin, piling small mounds of dust and nuggets along the bank. By dusk he had more than a man could carry. His hands shook as he wrapped the ore in oilskin. He looked to the sky and said softly, "They'll have to believe me now." But as night came, the canyon changed its voice. The wind began to moan low between the walls, carrying a strange sound like whispering. The same symbols he'd found before glowed faint under starlight, old Spanish crosses carved deep in the rock. He traced one with his fingers. The stone was warm, almost pulsing. It came to him then. Maybe the gold had never been meant to be taken. He thought of the Spaniards who'd marked this place centuries ago. None had lived to tell their tale. The Crow called it the River of Fire, a place the spirits kept for themselves. Red sat there long into the night, listening. The whispers rose and fell with the wind, soft and mournful. The firelight from his camp danced against the canyon walls until the gold veins seemed to move like molten metal flowing under skin. He felt small then, smaller than he'd ever been, a single heartbeat in a land that had outlasted empires. When dawn came, he packed the ore and started to climb. Halfway up, he looked back one last time. The sunlight struck the river, and for a moment the whole gorge blazed white and gold. It looked alive like the mountain was breathing light. He knew then that no man could truly own it. Still, he smiled through cracked lips and whispered, "They said it was a hoax." Then he turned toward the east, where the world waited and vanished into the rising heat, a speck swallowed by the endless stone. Years later, prospectors searching near the Wind River Range found traces of gold, but never the canyon itself. Some said the mountain buried it again, as if it had never been. Others swore that on certain summer evenings, when the sun cuts low, the cliffs burn with gold light, and the wind carries a voice laughing through the gorge. They said he'd died up there. Trappers coming down from the Wind River country told stories how Red Hanlon's camp was found empty, his rifle leaning against a stone, his fire long cold. Some swore they saw his ghost on moonlit ridges, still searching for that golden canyon. Others said he'd struck it rich and gone mad, burying his hoard before the mountains swallowed him whole. But in the spring of 1842, a man who looked like Red Hanlon limped into Street Louis. He was thinner now, hair gone white beneath a battered hat, his face cut with wind lines deep as scars. His coat was ragged, but his eyes, those fierce, ember-bright eyes, still burned with the same fire that had once made men listen before they laughed. He carried a single mule and a small chest bound in iron. He walked straight to the riverfront tavern called the Pike's Rest, where the city's few remaining mountain men still gathered. Inside, the smell of whiskey, pipe smoke, and sweat hung thick as fog. A few heads turned, squinting. "Hanlon?" someone muttered. "Hell, I thought you froze to death a decade ago." Red smiled, faintly. "Guess I thawed." He ordered whiskey and sat by the hearth, silent until the room grew curious. Finally, he unlatched the iron chest. Inside lay rough nuggets of dull yellow metal, heavy and pure. The firelight danced over them like living flame. The tavern fell silent. "Saints alive!" one man breathed. Red poured the gold onto the table with a sound like rain. "You all remember that map I showed at Green River?" he said. "The one you called a hoax?" A few faces went pale. "I found it," he went on quietly. "The river, the canyon. Everything I said was true." They crowded close, old trappers, freight men, speculators, each trying to touch the gold. Red let them, watching with the calm of a man who'd already outlived their disbelief. When the room settled, he began to speak. He told them of the canyon, the walls striped in quartz and gold, the Spanish carvings, the storm that buried half the river, and how he'd nearly died trying to climb out. He told them he'd stayed there through a winter, panning by hand, living off elk jerky and melted snow, too afraid to leave what he'd found. "Why'd you come back?" someone asked. Red looked into the fire. "Because I learned the mountain don't share what it don't want to." A younger man, sharp suit, city hands, stepped forward. "If this is real, Mr. Hanlon, you could start a company. Mining, exploration. The government would back you." Red laughed softly. "I brought back enough proof for a dozen fortunes, and not one of them matters. You want to dig that canyon, you'll need more than men and mules. You'll need luck and permission." "Permission?" The man frowned. "From whom?" Red's smile faded. "From whatever guards it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Red stood, repacked the gold, and fastened the chest. "I've seen men die for less than a handful of that dust. I'll not be the one to lead another there." He left the tavern, under a heavy sky. 3 days later, Red appeared again, this time at the office of Thomas Pritchard, the same clerk who'd once called him a liar. Pritchard, now older and heavier, blinked in disbelief as Hanlon stepped through the door. "Good Lord," he said, standing. "It is you," they said. "I know what they said," Red interrupted, setting the chest on the desk. "Here's what they didn't believe." When Pritchard saw the contents, his breath caught. Red leaned forward. "That's just a fraction of it, enough to prove I wasn't mad. But that canyon, she don't give up her secrets easy. I'm done chasing her." Pritchard's hands trembled slightly. "If you'd let me arrange an expedition, no," Red said flatly. "You'll keep this as record. Tell your government men there's gold in those mountains if they want to bleed for it. But you tell 'em too the mountain remembers." He straightened, his bones creaking like old timbers. "I'm going home, Pritchard. East, maybe. I've spent half my life trying to prove a ghost was real. Now I just want to forget her." The clerk nodded slowly, awed into silence. When Red left that day, he vanished from all official record. Yet that was not the end of his story. That winter, a band of prospectors headed west with copies of Hanlon's sketches. None returned. The next spring, trappers along the Sweetwater River found their camp buried in rockfall. Among the wreckage was a torn page from Hanlon's journal, scrawled in his unmistakable hand. The river shines even in darkness. But not all light is meant for men. As for Red himself, some said he settled quietly near Independence, Missouri, working a small patch of land and living out his days in peace. Others swore they met him again years later, farther west, wandering alone near the Tetons, older, slower, but still looking for something only he could see. The gold from his chest was melted down, its origin lost to time. But legends have their own currency. Even decades later, when miners struck rich veins in California and Colorado, the old mountain men whispered of Red Hanlon's river of the canyon that glowed like fire in the sun, and the man who found it only to walk away. In the archives of the American Mountain Men Association, there remains one final note attributed to him, written in an unsteady hand. "If I did find gold, it weren't for me to keep. It was for the mountain to remember me by." And so it did. For when the sun sets over the western slope of the Wind River Range and the light turns red as blood, the stone seems to shimmer faintly as if beneath it, the earth still hides a river that burns, waiting for the man who proved it was real.